Most AI governance programs in the mid-market are still policy programs. They have the documents, they have the inventory, and they have the review committee. What they don't have is the system that produces evidence at the moment the control operates. That's not a documentation problem, but rather an architecture problem. This episode is about that architecture. It's not about the slide deck or the framework chart. It's the actual mechanical layer that holds when an examiner asks the question that your policy can't answer on its own. Episode 3 closed on the cosmetic to structural distinction. Programs that produce documents versus programs that produce contemporaneous evidence. The 5-question exposure framework. The flinch. This episode picks up with the practitioner's next question. If structural is the goal, then what does the architecture really look like? So we're at the architect stage of the diagnostic arc. Diagnose was the first field. Expose was the honest reading. Architect is the design. And prove comes next. I'm going to give you 3 architectural primitives. Each one sits at a specific layer of the governance spine. Each one converts a policy intention into a mechanism. None of them are theoretical. All 3 were built at a $3.5 billion financial institution that moved into federal supervision through a bank charter acquisition, and they survived because the mechanism was real. The governance spine is 5 stages: appetite, strategy, controls, evidence, and reporting. In episode 2, I introduced it as a structural map, and in this episode, it operates as a substrate. A substrate is the surface that architecture is built on, and every architectural decision lands on a spine stage. If a decision doesn't land on a spine stage, then it's not architecture, it's preference. The spine by itself reads as a stack, bottom to top, with appetite as the foundation, reporting as the surface, and the 3 middle stages in between doing the work. It serves as the main support system for your organization. So, when an institution says, we're doing AI governance, the first thing I try to determine is what stage of the spine they're operating on. Most of them answer at the strategy stage, where they have a strategy document, they may have a roadmap, but they might not yet have an appetite statement underneath the strategy. They don't have controls instrumented above the strategy. They've got one stage, and they're doing about 1/5 of the actual work required. Here's the catch. The spine is sequential. You cannot skip a stage. You cannot operate strategy without first defining your appetite. You cannot run controls without a strategy, and you can't produce reliable evidence without defined controls. You can't provide reporting or oversight without proper evidence generation. When your risk appetite has been properly set by the board, the strategy has been translated, informed by the appetite, your controls are designed to then enforce the strategy, evidence can be generated in line with those controls, and reporting can be used to consolidate and analyze the evidence. The reporting stage also closes the continuous feedback loop by providing oversight and reporting metrics back to the board. Thus, the entire program has defensibility and is being managed throughout. An auditor can walk the sequence, and the sequence will hold. And that is well-designed governance architecture. We're going to move into something called the Decision Authority Matrix. The Decision Authority Matrix is implemented at the control stage, and it maps AI risk tier to an approval authority with the required evidence artifacts. It's 4 variables into one artifact: risk tier, governed action, required authority, and evidence requirement. Most institutions have an approval matrix. What they don't have is the binding logic that says a critical tier system requires board or executive committee approval, a high tier system requires senior management with documented risk acceptance, a medium tier system requires department head with a security review, and a low tier system requires at least a manager acknowledgement with an acceptable use attestation. The matrix isn't the chart. The matrix is really the mechanism that prevents a medium-tier system from quietly becoming a critical tier system through scope creep without reapproval. That single failure mode, scope change without reevaluation, is one of the most commonly overlooked risks in mid-market AI governance programs today. The architecture closes the loop by requiring reapproval at the new risk level. If a system's scope changes, the authority required to approve it changes. And if the authority changes, the evidence required changes. Scope creep can't escape the matrix because the matrix sits on the control stage of the spine and it feeds the evidence stage above it. What I've just described is mechanism design. It's not policy documentation. Policy says that AI systems will be reviewed when scope changes, but a mechanism says that scope changes trigger a workflow that routes to the authority tier that the new scope requires and produces a signed approval record before a change is permitted. The third primitive is contemporaneous evidence. These are system-generated records that are produced the moment a control operates in a format that an examiner can easily walk. This is the evidence stage of the spine, and it's made architecturally. Evidence isn't the binder that you assemble before the exam. It's the artifact that the system produced in real time when the control executed and its work was completed. The distinction is operational. A policy binder produced 3 weeks before an exam is post hoc evidence. An access approval record that was generated by the identity and access management platform at the moment the access was granted is contemporaneous evidence. The first one tells the examiner what the institution intended, but the second one tells the examiner what actually happened, and it's the one they want to see. And this requires an architectural shift. So where does contemporaneous evidence live? It's got to live in the platform that's performing and executing the control. An identity and access management platform has to produce the identity evidence. Your PAM platform should produce your privileged access evidence, much like your model registries should produce your model lifecycle evidence. The architecture has to be well designed and platform instrumented. It cannot be held together simply by a policy document. When an examiner asks, "Show me how a control operated on a specific date," your contemporaneous evidence answers that question in seconds. However, traditional evidence often takes days, a manual process for retrieval, and may not even produce the record that they are looking for and will hold up. The architectural difference is whether your institution can produce truth at the speed of the question, and the sooner you can produce it, the more credibility and defensibility your program has. When an institution builds contemporaneous evidence into their architecture, they're not preparing for an adversarial examiner encounter. They're simply operating at the standard a competent examiner is going to look for. The architecture is the institutional commitment to operating at that standard every day, not just the 3 weeks leading up to the exam. So let's map these three back to the spine. The spine as substrate is the position from which the architecture is designed. The decision authority matrix sits on the control stage and feeds into the evidence stage. Your contemporaneous evidence sits on the evidence stage and then feeds reporting. And what you have when these three operate together is a closed loop sequence. Appetite at the bottom, strategy translates it, controls enforce it, the evidence proves it, and reporting summarizes it for the board, the auditor, and your examiner. 5 stages, 1 continuous sequence, and the architecture is the sequence. The 2 remaining spine stages, appetite and reporting, are where most institutions need the least architectural work and the most clarity. The architecture lives in the middle 3 stages, strategy, controls, and evidence. And this is where the mechanism is built, and that's where the architecture either holds up or it will crumble under pressure. If you are running a governance program at a mid-market institution and the architectural picture that I just described feels distant from what you have, you're not behind, you're in the field. The cosmetic to structural transition is the work, and most programs are mid-transition, and that's just the honest truth of where companies are today. The practical move here is to pick one spine stage and instrument one mechanism. Not all 5, not all 3 primitives at once. One stage, one mechanism, one cycle of evidence. The decision authority matrix on the control stage is the highest leverage starting point because it produces evidence the moment it operates and it forces clarity at the strategy stage above it. The architectural posture is the operating posture, and the institution that builds architecture is not protecting itself from the examiner. It's meeting the standard that a competent governance program has always required and strived for. When the examiner arrives, the architecture holds, and the conversation is short. Episode 5 closes the diagnostic arc on Prove. What does the institution look like when the architecture has been operating long enough to produce a track record? How does maturity decay, which is the post-engagement risk that every implementation faces, get prevented? If you want a structural read of where your institution sits on the spine, our diagnostic call is a 30-minute conversation that will map your current spine stage and surface the gap that is most likely to fail in an upcoming exam. Book your call today at voidvanguard.com. Capability without catastrophe. That is the standard.